For years, Burkina Faso lived under a quiet but constant threat. Villages emptied at night. Roads became uncertain passages. Farmers worked their land knowing that violence could arrive without warning. In this atmosphere of fear, the state appeared distant, restrained by hesitation and half measures. Then, one sentence changed the tone of the nation. When Ibrahim Traore declared that terrorists had only two choices, to leave Burkina Faso or die, it was not a rhetorical flourish. It was a line drawn between survival and collapse. Burkina Faso did not reach this moment by accident. Armed groups had expanded their reach, turning remote areas into zones where the authority of the state barely existed. These groups did not only attack soldiers, they disrupted daily life, closed schools, forced families to flee, and made normal economic activity almost impossible. Over time, frustration grew among civilians and within the armed forces. Many felt that warnings, negotiations, and international advice had failed to stop the bleeding. Against this backdrop, Traoré emerged not as a conventional politician, but as a wartime leader shaped by urgency. His words reflected a belief shared by many citizens that the country was running out of time. The ultimatum signaled the end of ambiguity. There would be no more gray zones where armed groups could hide behind ideology or geography. Either they would abandon Burkina Faso, or they would face direct and decisive force. This message was not aimed only at the enemy. It was also meant for the army, for civil institutions, and for ordinary people who needed to know where the state stood. For the armed forces, it clarified the mission. For civilians, it restored a sense that someone was willing to act. For terrorist groups, it removed any illusion that patience or negotiation would save them. The ultimatum marked a turning point because it transformed fear into resolve. It prepared the ground for legal changes, military escalation, and a new security doctrine based on speed and precision. What followed was not chaos, but a calculated shift from defensive posture to active pursuit. To understand why Burkina Faso moved so decisively, one must first understand the pressure that built up before this moment, when survival itself became the central question facing the nation. When Ibrahim Traore stated that terrorists had only two options, to leave Burkina Faso or die, the power of the message did not come from anger. It came from clarity. For years, armed groups operated in spaces where the state hesitated to define clear limits. That hesitation created a dangerous illusion. Terrorists believed time was on their side. Traore's ultimatum shattered that belief by removing uncertainty and replacing it with a single, unmistakable outcome. This declaration functioned as psychological warfare before the first shot was fired. Terrorist networks depend not only on weapons, but on perception. They survive by projecting endurance, by convincing recruits and local populations that they cannot be defeated, by issuing a public and uncompromising ultimatum. Traoré reversed that narrative. He framed the conflict as finite. Either the armed groups would withdraw, or they would be eliminated. There would be no endless stalemate. The message also carried a deeper strategic purpose. It signaled a shift away from policies that relied on negotiation without enforcement. In the past, warnings were often followed by delays, debates, or appeals to external partners. This time, the statement was designed to be irreversible. Once spoken, it could only be validated through action. That is why the ultimatum mattered not just for what it said, but for what it demanded from the state itself. Inside the armed forces, the effect was immediate. Soldiers no longer faced mixed signals about restraint versus engagement. The mission became simple and unified. Clear language reduced hesitation on the ground and strengthened discipline. When orders align with political authority, military operations gain momentum. Traoré's words provided that alignment. For civilians, the ultimatum offered something that had been missing for a long time certainty. Even those who feared escalation understood that indecision had already failed. The statement acknowledged the reality people lived with every day. It recognized that fear had a cost, and that survival required firm decisions. Internationally, the ultimatum was interpreted as provocative, but within Burkina Faso, it was seen as overdue. It marked the moment when leadership stopped managing the crisis and started confronting it directly. In that sense, the ultimatum was not an endpoint. It was the opening move in a broader strategy that would soon combine law, force, and speed to reclaim control of the nation's territory. The ultimatum issued by Ibrahim Traore did not stand alone. It was quickly reinforced by a legal decision that changed the rules of the conflict. The restoration of the death penalty for acts of terrorism marked a turning point in how Burkina Faso defined justice during a time of existential threat. This was not presented as punishment for its own sake, but as a declaration that certain crimes had crossed a line beyond compromise. For years, terrorism had been treated through a mixture of military response and legal ambiguity. Arrests were made, but long judicial processes and unclear sentencing weakened deterrence. Armed groups understood this gap and exploited it. The reactivation of capital punishment closed that gap. It sent a message that participation in terrorism was no longer a gamble with temporary consequences, but a choice carrying the highest possible cost. The legal impact was immediate inside the security apparatus. Judges, prosecutors, and military commanders now operated within a unified framework. Actions on the battlefield were no longer disconnected from the justice system. Law and force began to move in the same direction. This alignment mattered because it reduced hesitation and confusion at every level of decision-making. Symbolically, the law carried even greater weight. It told citizens that the state recognized the depth of their suffering. It acknowledged that mass killings, village raids, and terror campaigns were not ordinary crimes. They were attacks on the survival of the nation itself. By invoking the strongest legal sanction available, the government framed terrorism as a threat comparable to war. Critics, especially abroad, focused on the moral implications of capital punishment. Inside Burkina Faso, the debate was different. Many citizens viewed the law as a defensive measure, not an act of vengeance. They had lived for years with funerals, displacement, and fear. For them, justice meant prevention, not symbolism. The question was not abstract morality, but whether the state could protect lives. In practical terms, the death penalty also supported the broader security strategy. It discouraged surrender tactics designed to exploit leniency. It pressured networks to fracture as fighters reconsidered the risks of continued involvement. Combined with military escalation, the law created a closed circle around terrorist groups, reducing both their options and their confidence. By restoring capital punishment, Burkina Faso signaled that survival required extraordinary measures. The law did not replace military action, it strengthened it. Together, they formed the legal and moral foundation for a campaign that no longer treated terrorism as a chronic problem, but as a threat to be eliminated. Once the legal foundation was set, Burkina Faso moved with speed. The ultimatum and the restoration of capital punishment were immediately followed by a broad military offensive designed to deny terrorist groups any time to adapt. This was not a single operation, but a sustained campaign. Units advanced simultaneously across multiple regions, forcing armed groups to remain on the move and preventing them from regrouping. A central element of this strategy was continuity. Operations did not pause after initial engagements. Pressure was maintained day after day, creating exhaustion within terrorist networks. Supply routes were disrupted, communication lines were broken, and familiar hideouts lost their value. The objective was simple: make survival inside Burkina Faso impossible for armed groups. Another defining feature was the decision to pursue threats all the way to the edges of national territory. Borders that once functioned as escape corridors were treated as operational limits to be secured, not barriers to action. By extending patrols and strikes toward frontier zones, the army aimed to eliminate the pattern of hit-and-run attacks followed by retreat across borders. This approach reinforced the idea that national sovereignty applied to every kilometer of land. Coordination played a decisive role. Intelligence, ground forces, and rapid response units worked in close alignment. Information gathered from one operation was immediately used to shape the next. This reduced the lag time that often allows insurgent groups to recover. Speed replaced hesitation as the defining characteristic of military decision-making. For soldiers, this phase marked a shift in posture. Defensive deployments gave way to active pursuit. Instead of guarding positions and reacting to attacks, units sought out enemy concentrations based on verified intelligence. This change altered morale. Troops who had long felt confined to containment duties now operated with a sense of initiative and purpose. The impact extended beyond the battlefield. Civilians in previously contested areas observed a visible return of state presence. Roads reopened, markets resumed activity, and displaced families began to consider returning home. While challenges remained, the message was clear. The state was no longer negotiating space with armed groups. It was reclaiming it. This continuous offensive demonstrated that the ultimatum was not symbolic. It was the opening phase of a military doctrine focused on pressure, persistence, and territorial control. By refusing to slow down or fragment its efforts, Burkina Faso transformed words into action and established the conditions for the targeted operations that would soon follow. As the military campaign intensified, one choice defined its character more than any other. Burkina Faso did not rely on mass troop deployments alone. Instead, it placed growing emphasis on elite special forces trained for speed, discretion, and precision. This decision reflected a hard lesson learned over years of conflict. Large formations can hold ground, but they are often too slow to dismantle mobile and adaptive terrorist cells. Special forces offered a different advantage. They were designed to move quickly, operate with limited visibility, and strike targets identified through reliable intelligence. Rather than overwhelming an area, they focused on isolating key figures, supply points, and command elements. This approach reduced unnecessary destruction and limited the exposure of civilians to prolonged fighting. Another critical factor was trust. Elite units were composed of soldiers selected for discipline and reliability. In an environment where infiltration and misinformation pose constant risks, these forces allowed commanders to act with confidence. Missions could be planned and executed without leaks, hesitation, or political interference. This internal cohesion proved essential when operations required secrecy and perfect timing. From a psychological perspective, the use of special forces sent a powerful signal. Terrorist leaders understood that they were no longer facing predictable patrols or defensive checkpoints. They were being hunted by units capable of striking without warning. This shifted the balance of fear. Armed groups accustomed to choosing when and where to attack now lived under constant uncertainty. The impact on morale within the army was also significant. Soldiers saw that skill and preparation were being rewarded. The success of elite units reinforced a culture of professionalism and competence. It demonstrated that the state valued effectiveness over spectacle. Victories achieved quietly but decisively carried more weight than loud but inconclusive battles. For civilians, the difference was visible in outcomes rather than tactics. Areas cleared by targeted operations experienced fewer cycles of retaliation and counterattack. Markets reopened faster. Daily life resumed with less disruption. Precision limited the long shadow that heavy fighting often leaves behind. By prioritizing special forces, Burkina Faso aligned its military practice with its strategic objective. The goal was not endless confrontation, but the dismantling of terrorist capability. Speed replaced attrition. Accuracy replaced excess. This choice prepared the ground for the most emblematic operation of the campaign, a mission that would demonstrate how precision could deliver decisive results in minutes rather than months. Operation Beba was designed to embody everything Burkina Faso had learned from years of conflict. Its name, drawn from a local language and understood as crushing the enemy, was not chosen for drama. It was chosen to reflect intent. This would not be a prolonged confrontation or a show of force. It would be a brief, decisive action aimed at removing a specific threat with absolute certainty. The operation targeted Traoré, a figure long identified by security services as a central node within terrorist networks. Intelligence confirmed his location, his routines, and the structure of his immediate protection. Once that picture was complete, planners focused on one priority: speed. The longer an operation lasts, the greater the risk of escape, civilian harm, or unintended escalation. Beba was built to end before those risks could materialize. In less than 10 minutes, special forces seized the advantage. Traoré and his close guards were neutralized before they could organize resistance. The precision of the strike left no room for confusion or counterattack. This was not a battle. It was an extraction of a threat from the security equation. When confirmation arrived that the target was eliminated, the mission was already over. The significance of Beba went far beyond the death of one man. It demonstrated that no position was untouchable, no leader beyond reach. Terrorist networks understood the message immediately. The state now possessed the capability and the will to act with surgical accuracy. Safe havens were illusions. Time was no longer an ally. For the armed forces, the operation validated the strategic shift toward elite units and intelligence-driven action. Planning, coordination, and discipline had replaced improvisation. Success did not depend on overwhelming force, but on correct timing and flawless execution. This reinforced confidence across the military structure. Among civilians, the reaction was equally important. Beba showed that promises were being fulfilled. The state was not merely pushing armed groups away, it was dismantling them piece by piece. In a conflict often measured in years, this operation proved that decisive change could occur in minutes. Operation Beba became a symbol. It represented a new phase of the war against terrorism in Burkina Faso, one where precision replaced persistence, and where the elimination of key figures accelerated the collapse of entire networks. Traoré was not just another name on a wanted list. Over time, he became a symbol of defiance against the state and a rallying figure for armed groups operating in the region. His presence represented continuity for terrorist networks, a sense that leadership could survive pressure and adapt to changing circumstances. As long as figures like Traoré remained alive, the idea of permanence sustained the insurgency. Security assessments identified him as a priority not because of publicity, but because of function. Traoré was a connector. He linked fighters to resources, coordinated movements, and reinforced discipline within his circle. His elimination was expected to do more than remove one individual. It was intended to disrupt patterns of command and weaken trust inside the network. The impact of his death was immediate and psychological. Terrorist groups often depend on the belief that their leaders are protected by distance, terrain, or loyalty. Operation Beba destroyed that belief. It showed that rank offered no immunity. Precision could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. This realization spread faster than any official announcement. Within armed networks, fear began to replace confidence. Fighters questioned their security, their leaders, and their future. Some reconsidered continued involvement. Others withdrew deeper into isolation, limiting coordination and reducing operational effectiveness. Fragmentation followed, exactly as planners had anticipated. For the population, Traoré's elimination carried a different meaning. It was proof that the state could identify and neutralize those responsible for years of violence. The name associated with raids, displacement, and fear was gone. While this did not end suffering overnight, it restored a sense of moral balance. Accountability, long absent, had returned. From a strategic standpoint, removing Burema accelerated the collapse of local cells tied to his authority. Networks built around individuals rarely survive intact when leadership disappears suddenly. Without his direction, cohesion weakened and operational tempo slowed. This created space for follow-up actions and stabilization efforts. Tal Burema's death thus became more than a tactical success. It was a demonstration of how targeted action against key figures can reshape an entire conflict. By focusing on the people who sustain violence, Burkina Faso struck at the core of the problem rather than its symptoms. As Burkina Faso intensified its campaign, reactions from Western governments and institutions followed a familiar pattern. Statements expressed concern about human rights, warned against excessive force, and questioned the long-term sustainability of a security strategy centered on military power. From afar, the ultimatum, the restoration of the death penalty, and operations like Waner Beba appeared harsh, even alarming. These criticisms were often framed in universal terms, but they revealed a disconnect between theory and lived reality. Burkina Faso was not debating abstract policy choices. It was confronting armed groups that had killed civilians, displaced entire communities, and undermined the very existence of the state. For many citizens, Western concerns seemed to arrive late, after years of suffering that received far less attention. One central criticism focused on capital punishment. From a Western perspective, the death penalty is frequently viewed as incompatible with modern justice. Inside Burkina Faso, the question was different. People asked whether a state under siege could afford leniency toward those who organized mass violence. The debate was not about ideals, but about survival. The right to life of innocent civilians weighed heavily against the rights of those who had deliberately taken life. Another criticism warned that force would only breed more extremism. This argument ignored the context of previous restraint. Years of limited engagement and negotiation had not reduced violence. In some cases, it allowed armed groups to entrench themselves further. Burkina Faso's response did not reject long-term development or reconciliation. It asserted that security must come first. Without safety, no social program can function. From a practical standpoint, operations like Waner Beba also challenged the idea of indiscriminate force. Precision, intelligence, and limited duration defined these missions. They were designed to reduce collateral harm, not expand it. This reality complicated the narrative of uncontrolled escalation often presented abroad. The experience of Burkina Faso offers a lesson to other nations facing similar threats. External advice is valuable, but it cannot replace local judgment. Each country must balance moral principles with the responsibility to protect its people. Burkina Faso chose decisiveness over paralysis, whether others agree or not. The choice reflects a belief shared by many societies under threat. Peace cannot be negotiated with those who seek destruction. In this sense, Western criticism became part of the story, not its conclusion. Burkina Faso did not reject dialogue. It rejected delay. And in doing so, it asserted that the first duty of any state is to ensure that its citizens can live without fear. For ordinary people in Burkina Faso, the sequence of events that followed the ultimatum marked a profound psychological shift. For years, fear had shaped daily life. Travel required calculation. Farming carried risk. Nightfall brought anxiety. What changed was not the absence of danger overnight, but the perception of who controlled it. The state was no longer reacting. It was acting. As military pressure increased and key figures were removed, communities began to sense a return of balance. Roads once avoided slowly reopened. Markets resumed activity. Families displaced by violence started to consider returning home. These were small steps, but they carried enormous meaning. They signaled that normal life was no longer an impossible dream, but a goal within reach. This shift in confidence was tied directly to leadership. Ibrahim Traore's approach resonated because it aligned words with outcomes. The ultimatum, the legal measures, and the operations that followed formed a single narrative. Citizens could see continuity rather than contradiction. That consistency rebuilt trust in institutions that had long appeared distant or powerless. The broader lesson of Burkina Faso's experience extends beyond its borders. Nations facing persistent violence often struggle between caution and decisiveness. Delay is frequently justified in the name of restraint, dialogue, or external approval. Burkina Faso chose a different path. It accepted the cost of firm decisions to regain control of its future. This choice does not offer a universal formula, but it highlights a principle often ignored. Security is the foundation upon which all other reforms depend. Western criticism, regional skepticism, and international pressure did not disappear. What changed was their relevance. Burkina Faso demonstrated that legitimacy begins at home. When citizens feel protected, external narratives lose their power. The state's first obligation is not to satisfy distant observers, but to ensure that its people can live without constant fear. The campaign against terrorism in Burkina Faso is not finished. Challenges remain, and rebuilding will take time. Yet the direction is clear. From the ultimatum to Operation Waner Beba, the message has been consistent. Violence will not be managed indefinitely. It will be confronted. If there is one lesson to carry forward, it is this. A nation under threat must choose clarity over ambiguity. Survival demands resolve. Burkina Faso chose to draw a line, to defend it, and to remind both its enemies and its people that peace is not granted by chance. It is secured by decision.